Hi, I'm Dr. Heather Williams. I'm a consultant medical physicist for nuclear medicine at the Christie Hospital. And today in this webinar, I'd like to provide you with some feedback on a meeting I organised back in February in Leeds in partnership with IPEM conferences entitled Higher Specialist Scientific Training, Equivalence and How to Get It. Now, this meeting was designed to answer questions I had about whether the qualifications, skills and experience I had were sufficient to apply for equivalence to HSST. And from conversations with colleagues in other departments up and down the country, I don't think I'm alone in having those questions. So we were joined by Elaine Jenkins from the Academy of Healthcare Scientists to provide an overview to start the meeting on HSST and equivalence to HSST, and then to answer some questions. And following that, we had a panel discussion with medical physicists and clinical engineers from a wide range of disciplines, providing some wisdom really from their own experience of obtaining equivalence and now of going on to assess applications for equivalence. I'd just like to say thank you again to IPEM conferences for running with the idea of this meeting and helping it run so well on the day, and welcoming us to the studio in Leeds. So these are Elaine Jenkins' slides, and I'd just like to go over this content to provide us with a bit of background. So I'm sure many of you will be familiar with HSST. It's a part-time doctoral level academic programme with work-based learning over 5 years. The trainees on this programme are well-established senior clinical scientists, and they remain in employment in their host institution during the course of HSST. And HSST includes a professional doctoral degree programme as well as work-based training and practical training and assessment. So the key features of the higher specialist scientific training programme is that it is bespoke. It's underpinned by the Academy for Healthcare Science Good Scientific Practice guidance, but what that actually means for the individual can be very bespoke, very tailored to the context in which they're working and their own training needs. And each trainee needs to collect evidence to demonstrate how they meet the standards of proficiency required at this level. So it's quite flexible, it's adaptable and responsive to the individual's own pathway and their own training needs. And in this way, it's really quite different to the STP training scheme, the postgraduate training scheme for those starting out in a career in medical physics. In the STP, there are specified competencies, there are well-defined rotations, there are well-defined types of workplace-based assessments, and the HSST doesn't really have that degree of structure. It has these overarching competencies that need to be demonstrated, but not in such a rigid way. There isn't the formality of STP in HSST. And because it's bespoke, it's negotiable, it's largely self-directed and independent, and it's more concerned with the experiences that the senior scientist goes through and how they reflect on that. And it can respond to many stakeholders who are invested in the service that the trainee is involved in delivering, and primarily concerned with presenting convincing evidence of clinical scientific competence at consultant level. And there's some more information about HSST available at this link. So what do we mean by equivalence in the context of HSST? Well, equivalence is looking at the training that is provided by HSST, looking at the experiences, qualifications, skills of the applicant to equivalence, and saying, well, have they brought that individual to the same point in their career? Have they developed them to the same extent? And it's really important that this equivalence assessment is very robust. The HSST is a demanding programme of work and study, and it requires a lot of investment of time inside and outside of the workplace. And if equivalence is going to be granted, then it requires a significant body of proof in order to convince the assessors that the experiences, qualifications, skills that the applicant has have brought them to that same place in their professional development. Now, the application fee for HSS equivalence is £280, and that's a fee every time you apply. And so it's best to wait until you're pretty confident that you're ready. But the good news is that the fees are eligible for tax relief, like our professional membership fees are, for example. So in terms of our reference points with HSSE, there's obviously the standards of proficiency for higher specialist scientists, which set out, the standards that you're expected to reach when you go through HSST, and the assessors will be reviewing the evidence with that curriculum in mind. There's also guidance as to how to draw equivalence between the type of training that's conducted under HSST and something that is more rooted in the day-to-day experience of a senior scientist working within the NHS at a near consultant level, or a clinical engineer working within the NHS at a near consultant level. So the HSST equivalence process has three stages, really. There is an initial application where administrative checks are done to ensure that the applicant is eligible to apply for HSST equivalence. So registration as a clinical scientist is a necessity, as are appropriate qualifications, a job description reflecting responsibilities at consultant or close to consultant level. And then the first stage of assessment follows on from that, when the assessors will review an expanded CV, a summary report, a verified job description, person specification, references, etc. So the purpose of this summary report is to show how the applicant's experience and skills map onto the requirements of HSST. And there are three possible outcomes at this stage. One is that equivalence is achieved. Two is that it's looking like the applicant is working at near consultant level, should have the recognition of the higher specialist scientist title, but they don't yet have enough evidence to be confident that that's the case. And in that case, a portfolio would be requested, where the applicant would have to provide further evidence that they are working at consultant level and have the appropriate level of experience to meet all of the standards of practice. And the third possible outcome is that equivalence has not been demonstrated, and you would have to go away, get further experience and reapply again. So you want to avoid that if you can, because it's not only quite dispiriting, it can get quite expensive. So should you need to submit a portfolio, you have 6 months to collate and present evidence, and the assessors will review that portfolio against the HSS standards of proficiency, and there are 3 outcomes at that stage. You'd either be acknowledged as demonstrating full equivalence, needing to provide even more evidence before a judgment could be made, or you could be told that you, again, not demonstrating equivalence. So if you need to provide further evidence, it would be going round the portfolio loop again. The assessment panel contains 3 assessors. One is a specialist within your own field of medical physics or clinical engineering. One is clinical from the same division, so from somewhere else in medical physics and engineering. And the other is a lay assessor, and it's really important to bear them in mind when writing applications and portfolio documents. So the portfolio, if it's required, would provide the assessors with more evidence that you have a sufficient period of training and experience. You're working at a consultant scientist level. That doesn't necessarily mean 8B, 8C, even 8D, 9 level. It isn't associated with banding. For more information about what consultant level responsibilities would look like, there is actually a consultant clinical scientist job description available online if you want to use that as a point of reference. You also have to demonstrate that you have a thorough understanding of the subject matter, that you have the knowledge, skills and competence to meet the standards of proficiency, and that those knowledge, skills, competence are equivalent to someone who's completed HSST. And in all of this, you want to demonstrate that you're professional, that you're competent, that you're reflective, so that you aren't just considering this as, right, I've got my consultant badge, I'm done. You have this attitude towards growing and developing and reflecting and improving. There's actually a reasonable amount of time and space available to providing this evidence. So a portfolio can be up to 200 pages. The initial summary reports can be up to 5,000 words. And you can supplement the portfolio and the summary report with individual documentary evidence. There is more information about this in the guidance. And there also needs to be a mapping template that's completed, showing how the experience and skills that are talked about in the report, and if necessary portfolio, map over onto the standards of proficiency. And that's actually a really helpful place to start in terms of determining whether you have the appropriate knowledge, skills and training in order to meet those standards of proficiency. So these are just some examples of the types of evidence that you can draw upon: 360-degree feedback, advice that you've given to employers, how you've dealt with incidents, the appraisals that you've been part of, either being appraised or appraising others, contributing to research governance, the summary of your experience that's provided in your CV, evidence of clinical audits undertaken and the results of the impact that has on service, the evidence of contributing to a multidisciplinary clinical team, examples of consultant level advice, examples of reports that you've given demonstrating an assessment perhaps of legislative compliance, and individual patient case studies for those of us who are very patient facing in our role, that demonstrate expertise, including assessments, reports, and advice that have been given, and also the expanded job description. In terms of developing skills as a researcher, you can provide evidence of that through peer-reviewed publications, presentations, grant applications and business cases, and a list of references is entirely appropriate. But you can also talk about other ways in which you've contributed to service development, through research development and innovation strategies, through service accreditation or certification, performance reviews, service reviews of quality improvements, particularly those that include patient and public inputs, strategic business plans, or a validation report on a new technique. And key to all of these is to reflect on the impact that you've made as a leading clinical scientist in each of those areas. And again, there's extensive guidance on how to do this available on the AHCS website. There's also, just to draw to your attention, an email address, Equivalence at ahcs.ac.uk, if you have any specific queries about equivalence. So moving on to our panel discussion, we were very fortunate to be joined by Claire Louise Chappell, who is Consultant Clinical Scientist and Head of Imaging Physics and Radiation Safety in Newcastle. And she spoke to us about her journey into this particular post and her current role, and how she had demonstrated equivalence and was now involved in assessing equivalence. Rob Farley then spoke about his journey into being head of medical physics in South Tees and his background in radiotherapy. And he was present with us as our radiotherapy specialist on the day, and the vast majority of attendees were actually from a radiotherapy background. Dr. Richard Scott, Consultant Clinical Scientist at Sheffield, recently moved to University Hospitals in Bristol, spoke from a clinical engineering perspective and how his experience outside of the NHS had contributed to the way that he organises his work inside the NHS, and in part how he demonstrated equivalence. Professor Azam Taktak joined us from the Royal Liverpool University Hospital. He's a consultant clinical scientist, specialising in electronics and electrical engineering. And he spoke about, again, from a perspective of clinical engineering, as well as from a general background as an equivalence assessor. So the questions we were posed in preparation for this meeting started with, what does it mean to be a consultant scientist? And our panellists provided a number of reflections on this question, which I've summarised in the next couple of slides. And the first point was that being a consultant scientist involves having oversight of your own specialist area, but also how it intersects with other specialisms. So it's not just being a very, very senior scientist in your own discipline. It's also about having that broader view of how your own discipline intersects with others, how we need to collaborate, how we need to join together to take medical physics and clinical engineering forward, and how healthcare in general forward. So it's not just about being very, very good at what you do, but also about how what you do and what your department does interfaces with what everyone else is up to, whether that's locally, regionally, or nationally. And involves the skills to be a leader, so to define a direction forward for the group of staff that you're involved in overseeing, and work with them to manage the changes necessary to step forward in that direction. So it's not just operational management of sorting out day-to-day problems on a day-to-day basis. It's much more strategic. And it's not just about, again, being a really, really good scientist and delivering your individual projects. It's about having that oversight about how the whole body of work that the departments involved in can be pulled together and used to take the department forward. Also involves taking accountability for the work that happens in your team, and also exerting influence to overcome barriers to progress, whether they are financial or interpersonal or more broadly cultural. How do you take accountability, and how do you challenge barriers to change? So yes, you're responsible for all of these things happening. You're also responsible for removing the barriers that would prevent them happening. And it also involves working to do the right thing in the face of perceived impossibility, which was a nice little turn of phrase that one of the panelists came out with. So you're presented with perhaps demands on the service that appear impossible. Well, how do you respond to that in the right way? Is there a way of working differently in order to deliver what's required? Is there a need to get more resource before that's possible? And Richard Scott shared this very useful diagram about the many sort of interleaving aspects of being a consultant clinical scientist. And it's taken from the Physician Competency Framework from CanMed, which is a Canadian society. And the diagram of what we expect of a consultant level medical expert includes being a scholar, a professional, communicator, collaborator, leader, health advocate, and all of those aspects are pulled together in that consultant role. And there are strong parallels between a consultant level medical expert and a consultant level healthcare scientist expert. So secondly, how do you provide sufficient evidence of research and service development, particularly if you don't have a PhD? So the advice from the panel was that you can demonstrate that you are doing noteworthy research and development equivalent to a PhD through peer-reviewed publications, primarily. Because out of a lot of PhDs, it would be ideal if you were able to publish the findings of the PhD and be able to share it with a wider audience. So if that is the desirable outcome for many PhDs, then if you deliver that outcome without a PhD, then surely that's demonstrating equivalence. There are other ways of demonstrating research at PhD level, either through presentations at scientific meetings, articles for professional journals, or for those who perhaps don't have as much involvement in academic projects that would tend to lead to publications and presentations, reports showing how service involvement projects have had an impact on patient management. So how has your work improved things for patients? And the panelists encouraged those in attendance to take a very broad and holistic view of what we mean by work benefiting patients. So not something that, for example, that improves outcome statistics, but perhaps you've done work on image optimization or dose sparing, and just think about, in a very broad sense, how your work has benefited patients. Also, how do you, as a clinical scientist, support clinical projects? So, the research projects in your department, what's the role of the scientist in shaping and enabling the research? And you are often involved in defining what happens as part of the research protocol as a healthcare scientist. The research protocol may well come to your department pretty light on detail, and it's sometimes the job of the clinical scientist to round that out into something that's robust and repeatable and will provide the information needed to the clinical team undertaking the research. Next, how do you provide sufficient evidence of soft skills? So when we talk about soft skills and the kind of attitudes that we expect consultant healthcare scientists to have, it's fairly straightforward to start with. The core values of the NHS, the organisation we work for, and also how these are translated into the core values of the organisations we work in. So you will probably have been asked at interview, if you work in an NHS organisation, questions designed to test how good a fit you are for the culture in your workplace. So you'll be asked questions about the values of the organisation that you're applying to work with, to check that you can demonstrate attitudes that are consistent with those values. So that's quite a good place to start. But you can move on from there to talk more about examples of how you've demonstrated those values. So, and where have you been an empathetic manager? Where have you led in a sympathetic, compassionate way? How do you deal with conflicts? How do you achieve consensus? How do you provide strategic direction for a very diverse team of individuals? And it's important in providing this evidence to focus on situations where you've led a specific project or piece of work, and not just talk about them in very general terms. And there's lots of opportunity for this in local interpretation and implementation of national law and standards, which is something even the medical physicists and clinical engineers get involved with a great deal. And even if you're not particularly patient-facing in your work, then you may well have a lot of involvement in managing people through the process of compliance with law and standards. And there's also a lot of opportunity for involvement in equality and diversity initiatives, and or putting together educational programs, which would again bring up the challenges of dealing with a diverse team to deliver a high standard and inclusive body of work. And it's important in all of this to frame everything in terms of how your work has improved the patient's lived experience. So again, lived experience gives you that breadth of being able to say that you're not just looking at improving the management of their condition, it's their experience overall that has been improved by the work that you've done. And management training courses and modules can be helpful in showing that you have a theoretical understanding of the principles that you should apply in various situations, but you need to provide evidence of practical implementation as well, as evidence of appropriate qualifications or taking up suitable training opportunities. And finally, it's not just what you say, it's how you say it. Tips for presentation of your summary report and, if needed, your portfolio. So most importantly, remember your application will be presented to a lay assessor. So as scientists, we are used to communicating with scientists. We're used to writing for an audience that already has a similar knowledge and understanding of our subjects as we do. And that won't be the case for the summary report, the portfolio. You'll be writing to an educated non-specialist. So there's an awful lot you can't assume about their knowledge of the detail of what you do. And it's really important to address this challenge by focusing on making the case for the difference you make to patients. So make this the focus of everything that you write and frame all of the technical scientific achievements in this way. So you would be tempted, if you are making the case for I'm a consultant level scientist, to go into great detail about the technical and scientific achievements that would provide evidence that you are working at consultant level. But the challenge here is to frame those technical and scientific achievements so that the benefit to patients of the work involved is very clear. And this skill of communicating the difference your science makes is often something that needs to be consciously developed. So there are opportunities in science communication, whether you're doing talks at science festivals or you have a stand at a careers fair in a local school, or you are perhaps writing a blog for a lay audience. All of these exercises can be really helpful in developing that ability to translate complex scientific achievements into this makes a difference because. Also, within the hospital, you could have opportunities for conversations with patient representatives, either as part of patient information committees or broader public engagement initiatives, where you can enhance your skills in communicating your work to a non-specialist audience. And get someone who isn't a medical physicist or clinical engineer to read your application. So if you give it to a friend who is going to be able to understand if you explain it well enough, then you can use whether they have actually understood you as a reasonable benchmark for how this report is going to be received by the lay assessor. In talking about your achievements, it's also really important to use active language like led, fostered, initiated. Don't be shy about taking ownership of what you did and your contribution to each body of work. Be very specific about what you actually did and the difference it made. And in looking for the work that you could present in this way, it's useful to start with a gap analysis. So draw up a spreadsheet listing what you've already done and trying to map this to each standard in each domain. And this is a really helpful exercise. It's one that I started after the meeting in February. And it really helps you identify where there are spaces in your skill set and what maybe the things that you need to work on a bit more before you could confidently say that you could apply successfully for HSS equivalence. If you can't map experience, skills, knowledge onto each of the standards in each of the domains, it's probably not the right time to apply yet. Hold off for a year, couple of years, until you've got a really solid body of evidence to present to the assessors. In more practical terms, when you come to present that evidence, make sure you structure your CV and other supporting evidence so it's really clear which domains the evidence links to. Use headings that make it really easy for the assessors to see where evidence links to standards. Assessors are often doing this work in addition to their role within the NHS, so anything that you can do to make that assessment process more straightforward for them will be greatly appreciated. So following this panel discussion, we had a Q&A session and further discussion of lunch. And in the afternoon, we had time for attendees to pull out the laptops and start work on that gap analysis, or start putting together their summary reports and discussing their CV that they were planning to submit. And feedback from that meeting was that several people are now well on the way to preparing an equivalence application following the time of this meeting, and in particular this afternoon workshop session where they had time to work on some of these documents with advice from the panelists. So that's the end of our webinar for today. I do hope that you found that helpful. Please do address any queries about equivalence to the AHCS email address within Elaine Jenkins' presentation. Also, there is an equivalence community of interest within IPEM. You can contact the IPEM office for details of how to join that.